Please arrest my dad." The chilling scream of the 6-year-old boy echoed through the police station, leaving every officer frozen in shock. A tiny child, tears streaming down his face, his hands gripping the front desk as if it were his last hope. No one could believe their ears. A child begging the police to arrest his own father. Officer Mary, a young cop, rushed over, kneeling down beside the boy. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "Please, he can't be let go. Arrest him now." The words sent a shiver through the room. Officers who had been casually sipping their coffee and reading reports dropped everything. Their eyes were locked on the boy, filled with utter disbelief. Chief Officer Paul, an older man with a stern expression, stepped forward. "Can you tell me what happened? Why would a child be so desperate that he would beg the police to arrest his father? Could this be a horrifying case of domestic violence? Or was there a deeper, more shocking truth hidden beneath it all?" This story will reveal a heartbreaking secret no one could ever have imagined. Don't miss the upcoming twists. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us as we uncover the haunting truth behind the boy's desperate plea. The town of St. John began another day, its pace slow and peaceful, just like any other. The police station sat at the heart of the town, an old building with faded red brick walls that had worn down over time. The morning sunlight filtered through the window panes, casting soft, hazy beams across the glossy wooden floors. The air in the dispatch room was thick with the smell of freshly brewed coffee, mixed with the scent of paper from the stack of files piled up on the desk. The rhythmic scratching of pens on paper, the rustling of newspapers, and the low murmur of conversations between officers created a familiar, quiet atmosphere that felt like any other morning. Chief Officer Paul sat behind a large desk, his glasses perched loosely on his nose as he quietly reviewed the overnight reports. A man of advanced years with salt and pepper hair and a neatly trimmed mustache. His face exuded sternness but held the calm of someone who had seen more than his fair share of events in this small town. Across from him, Officer Mary stirred her coffee gently, her eyes focused on her computer screen, though her mind seemed to drift far away. She was one of the newer recruits, but quickly won everyone's affection with her enthusiasm and kind heart. In the corner of the room, a group of officers huddled around a long wooden table, animatedly discussing last night's basketball game. Laughter erupted as one of them told a funny story, adding a relaxed touch to the room. Everything in the station felt perfectly normal, even a bit mundane. Everyone assumed it would be like any other day, a quiet one filled with administrative tasks, a few minor traffic violations, maybe even a call about a lost dog from an elderly woman living on the outskirts of town. But that peace didn't last long. Outside the window, the sun climbed higher, its rays growing fiercer. A strong gust of wind rattled the signboards hanging in front of the station. In that brief moment, there was an almost invisible shift in the atmosphere, as if something unseen were stirring, signaling that something unusual was about to happen. But no one in the police station noticed it. They continued sipping their coffee, chatting as if nothing were different. And then, the police station door burst open. A loud noise shattered the stillness. Officers all looked up in unison, and in that split second, they were all frozen by what they saw. A small boy, frantic, panting heavily, rushed inside with wide, terrified eyes. His face was smeared with tears, his black hair clinging to his forehead with sweat. His little legs trembled, but he still struggled to keep his balance, running as fast as he could to the front desk. In the suffocating silence, his small, desperate voice rang out, sending a chill through every officer present. "Please arrest my dad." The sound of the door crashing open still lingered in the air when a small boy rushed into the police station. His entire body was soaked with sweat, his black hair matted to his forehead, and his face smeared with tear streaks that hadn't dried yet. It seemed as though the boy had been running for a long time, his breath ragged, his chest heaving with every broken gasp. His eyes, wide and filled with panic, scanned the room as if searching for something, or more precisely, someone who could help him. But what left all the officers in the station frozen wasn't the boy's disheveled appearance or his heavy breathing. It was the first words he uttered when he stepped inside. "Please arrest my dad." The boy's voice ripped through the air, shattering the calm of the morning. The desperation in every word he spoke made every officer in the room freeze. Half-finished cups of coffee were abandoned, reports left forgotten on desks, and every conversation abruptly ceased. No one could understand what was happening. Bewildered glances were exchanged as the stunned officers processed what they were hearing. A child, barely 6 years old, was begging the police to arrest his own father. This was not something they ever expected to hear. The boy stumbled toward the front desk, his small hands clutching the surface as if holding on for dear life, afraid that without the support, he would collapse right then and there. His breath was still uneven, but he didn't stop trying to get his message across, one that he had been repeating in his mind throughout his frantic run. His red, watery eyes locked onto the woman behind the desk as he spoke again, his voice shaking but no less pleading. Please, he can't be let go. Arrest him now. In all the years the officers had worked here, they had seen all kinds of people come through that door. Criminals, victims, drunks causing trouble, even lost children. But they had never seen a child voluntarily begging the police to arrest his own father. This wasn't mischief or a child's misunderstanding. There was nothing childish in Henry's eyes. What they saw was pure fear, a deep panic etched into every feature, every breath, every word he spoke. Officer Mary immediately bent down, gently placing her hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling his small body trembling uncontrollably. Her eyes were filled with concern, but her voice tried to remain soft and reassuring. Calm down, sweetie. What's your name? What did your dad do? She asked. But Henry seemed not to hear. He still clung to the front desk, his eyes wide with desperation. His breath came in short, frantic gasps, as if every word he spoke drained the last bit of his strength. My dad can't be let go. Please arrest him now. Henry repeated, his voice choking on a sob. Tears continued to stream down his face, dripping onto his small hands clutching the edge of the desk, as if it was the only thing keeping him upright in that moment. Mary frowned, sensing that something wasn't right. Children sometimes get scared over small things, but Henry's eyes were not those of a child simply acting out or misunderstanding. They were the eyes of someone terrified to their core, as if speaking the words immediately was the only thing preventing something dreadful from happening. From a distance, Chief Officer Paul, who had been observing everything from the beginning, finally stood up from his chair. He walked over calmly, though his eyes were filled with suspicion. A 6-year-old boy walks into a police station begging for his father to be arrested. This was not something to be taken lightly. After years of being a police officer, Paul had witnessed his fair share of domestic violence cases where children were so abused by their parents they were terrified to the point of begging for help. But there was something different here. Henry wasn't just frightened, he was pleading desperately. Paul stopped right in front of the boy, lowering himself so their eyes could meet. Henry, I'm Paul. I want to help you, but you need to tell me what's going on. What did your dad do? He asked, his voice warm but serious. The boy opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. His lips trembled, his small hands tightened their grip on the desk, and his tiny shoulders continued to shake with each breath. Henry stared intently at the chief, as though his mind was spinning with thousands of thoughts, but every time he tried to speak, he swallowed the words back down. The room seemed to freeze around them, with all the officers silently watching. The moments stretched on like hours. No one could understand what was going on in the boy's mind, but one thing was clear. There was a terrible secret that Henry hadn't been able to voice. The entire police station was enveloped in a heavy silence, thick with unease. Officers exchanged cautious glances, their faces contorting into frowns as they tried to make sense of the situation unfolding before them. No one dared speak the words out loud, but in their minds, the same thought hung like a heavy cloud. This could be a serious case of domestic violence. Mary's gaze flicked to Paul, her eyes searching for his direction. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, her intuition telling her that something much deeper was at play here. Henry still stood there, small and fragile, his tiny shoulders trembling with every shallow breath. The boy hadn't yet been able to explain what had happened, but the panic in his eyes was enough to speak volumes. He was terrified, and terrified children don't run into police stations, don't scream for their father to be arrested, unless something truly desperate had driven them to it. Mary could see the fear in him, could feel the weight of it in her own chest. Paul, having seen countless cases like this before, knew it too. The child's plea was genuine. Paul took a slow, measured breath, feeling the gravity of the moment. His gaze swept across the room, assessing the officers present, each one processing the situation in their own way. We need to act immediately, Paul said, his voice quiet but commanding, filled with an authority that left no room for hesitation. "We're not letting this slip through the cracks." Mary nodded, determination hardening her expression as she stepped forward. Her posture softened as she knelt to Henry's level. Her voice was calm, trying to give him some sense of security amidst the storm. "Henry," she asked gently, her tone coaxing, "can you tell me what's going on? Did your dad hurt you?" The boy shook his head vigorously, his wide eyes blinking in panic. But before Mary could speak again, Henry suddenly recoiled, his body stiffening as though something had triggered a horrifying memory. His eyes darted frantically around the room, his gaze shifting back and forth as if searching for an escape. It was as if the words he was about to say were so dangerous, so terrifying, that even uttering them could summon something worse. The way he shrank back in fear sent a sharp pang through Mary's chest. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It was something far darker. Paul observed Henry's reaction carefully, his mind working in overdrive. He understood that the boy couldn't provide more details at this moment. Whatever had happened, it was clear Henry was too afraid to speak freely. Without wasting another second, Paul motioned to another officer, his voice firm. "Verify the boy's address. Get a team out there right now. We can't afford to waste any more time." The officers immediately sprang into action, their movements swift and purposeful as they rushed to gather the information needed. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the station, a sharp reminder that this was no longer a routine investigation. This was becoming an emergency. Mary turned her attention back to Henry, her heart aching at the sight of him clutching the desk, his small hands gripping the edge as if it were his only anchor. His eyes, filled with terror, betrayed a deep, raw fear that no child should ever have to experience. Her lips parted in an attempt to comfort him, but the words were slow to come. "We'll go check it out, Henry," she said softly, offering a reassuring smile, though it felt like a poor attempt at easing the storm within him. "You don't need to worry anymore. We're here to help." But Henry didn't seem to hear her. His grip tightened on the desk, his tiny frame trembling. The fear in his eyes only deepened, as if he feared that the very act of speaking would bring something worse, something terrible. Mary's heart broke as she looked at him, knowing that she couldn't force him to speak, but understanding that the situation required urgent action. Then, a voice from across the room cut through the tension. A young officer, his voice tinged with anger and frustration, spoke up. "If the kid's scared this much, it's definitely more than just beating. It could be worse." His words hung in the air, reverberating in the silence like a weight dropping in a quiet room. The others in the room exchanged uneasy glances. Domestic violence had appeared in this town before, but this was different. A child coming into the police station begging for their father to be arrested? This was unheard of. The air in the room seemed to thicken. No one wanted to imagine the worst-case scenario, but the reality was that everyone understood the gravity of the situation. It wasn't just a case of a child being scared. There was more to this, something hidden beneath the surface that was too dangerous to ignore. They were possibly racing against time to save a child from a nightmare that no one should ever have to endure. Mary's mind raced as she processed the fear she saw in Henry, the desperate plea for help. She could feel her own heart beating faster with the urgency of the moment. They needed to act now. There was no room for hesitation, not when a child's life could be at stake. The atmosphere was thick with tension as the patrol cars sped toward the outskirts of St. John, where Henry's house lay. The officers exchanged no words. Their minds were occupied with a single, shared thought. They knew this wasn't just another routine call. They were heading into the unknown, uncertain of what awaited them inside that house. A violent, enraged man might be waiting behind the door, prepared to resist arrest, perhaps even harm the child if he realized his time was up. In domestic violence cases, the situation could spiral into something tragic in the blink of an eye. They couldn't afford to make any missteps. The car skidded to a halt in front of a crumbling house, its dilapidated structure standing in stark contrast to the life they hoped to protect. The weathered wooden walls sagged, and the rusted tin roof seemed barely held together by time itself. Overgrown shrubs and vines crawled across the yard, obscuring what little remained of the once neat property. The headlights of the patrol cars illuminated the aged front door, its paint chipped and peeling, an omen of the neglect within. The lead officer signaled to his team, and they immediately readied themselves for action, guns drawn, their fingers tightened around the triggers. The air was taut with anticipation. There could be no room for mistakes. If there was a dangerous individual inside, they needed to move fast to protect Henry. Police, open the door now, one officer shouted, his voice strong and authoritative. But the silence that followed was unsettling. No movement, no sound. The house remained eerily quiet, a haunting stillness settling over everything. A gust of wind howled through the cracks in the window, causing it to creak open slightly, the faintest hint of darkness seeping through. The officers knew that whatever waited inside could be deadly, and they could not afford to hesitate. Breaching the door came the swift command. Without further delay, one officer kicked the door with all his might, sending it flying open with a loud crash. The door splintered on impact, revealing the darkened interior. Flashlights cut through the gloom, their beams slicing across the room, revealing the chaos inside. The house was disturbingly cluttered, trash and belongings scattered across the floor as though life had been abandoned here long ago. But there were no immediate signs of struggle or violence, which made the situation even more unsettling. The stench of dampness and mildew filled the air, mingling with the faint, rancid odor of spoiled food. The smell was overpowering, clinging to the air like a silent testament to neglect. One officer took the lead, signaling for the rest of the team to move deeper into the house. Their hearts pounded in their chests as they cautiously advanced through the cluttered hallway, every step echoing through the silence. Their eyes scanned every corner, every shadow, uncertain of what they might find next. Was the man they were searching for hiding somewhere in the dark, ready to ambush them? Or was there something far more sinister lurking within the walls, something that hadn't yet revealed itself? The officers moved carefully, aware that they were not just entering an abandoned house. They were stepping into a volatile situation, one that could explode into violence at any second. Every room they passed seemed to close in on them, suffocating them with the tension of the unknown. As they moved deeper, the sense of dread continued to grow. The house felt wrong, but they couldn't pinpoint why. Each officer's grip tightened on their weapons as they made their way through the house, but they still moved cautiously, not wanting to make a misstep. They had a job to do, and they couldn't let the fear of what might happen cloud their judgment. They needed to find out what had really been going on inside these walls, and whether Henry's cries had been the first sign of something far worse than they had anticipated. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked under the weight of an unseen presence, and the tension in the room became palpable. The officers froze, listening intently. Was it the wind, or was someone, or something, waiting for them in the shadows? The hairs on the back of their necks stood on end, and their breath came in shallow, cautious gasps. The unknown was closing in, and they couldn't let it overwhelm them. They had a child to protect. In that instant, they knew that this was no longer just a typical call. This was an emergency. The dark truth of the house was still a mystery, but they were determined to face it head-on. What they were about to find could change everything. The flashlights sliced through the darkness, casting harsh beams over every crevice of the room as the officers moved cautiously inside. Each step was deliberate, the air thick with tension as they advanced into the house. The scene before them was nothing like what they had expected. There were no signs of a violent abuser, no overturned furniture, no broken items, and certainly no angry shouts. The house was eerily quiet, almost too still. Instead, they found a frail figure curled up on an old, weathered bed, surrounded by the dark corners of the cramped room. The man who they had believed to be a heartless aggressor looked almost unrecognizable. His body was barely more than skin and bone, his oversized clothes dirty and tattered. His disheveled hair hid part of his gaunt face, and his hollow eyes blinked slowly, as if the mere act of acknowledging their presence required all the energy he had left. Roger, the man they had anticipated to be a ruthless abuser, did not appear to be the monster they imagined. He looked more like someone who had been drained of every last ounce of strength by the hardships of life. His face lacked the angry defiance they were prepared to face. There was no rage, no malice in his expression. Instead, his eyes were empty, distant, as if the weight of the world had crushed him. As the light from their flashlights landed on him, he did not react aggressively, but instead seemed too exhausted to fight back. The officers could see the fragility in his demeanor. His very presence screamed vulnerability rather than violence. His eyes locked with theirs, but there was no aggression, no defensive posturing. His voice was so faint it barely reached their ears. "Where's Henry?" he whispered, the words falling from his lips with a quiet desperation. The room seemed to freeze in that moment. The officers stood motionless, unsure of how to respond to the situation unfolding before them. There were no sounds of a scuffle, no indication of a dangerous confrontation. But that did not change the fact that they had entered this house with the assumption that they would confront an abuser. And yet, what they faced instead was a man who looked far from the image of the violent criminal they had been prepared for. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, as each officer exchanged looks with one another. No one spoke. The air was so still it felt like time itself had paused. Was this really the man they were searching for? The man who had allegedly tormented his own son? Roger's disheveled appearance and fragile state seemed to contradict the reports they had been given. His words, though barely audible, seemed to reflect something deeper, something that didn't fit with the scenario they had anticipated. There was no rage in his voice, no self-preservation, just an overwhelming, almost tragic sense of confusion. "Henry," Roger repeated, his voice shaking, a tremor of panic now creeping in. "Where is Henry?" The officers exchanged uneasy glances. They had come here with one goal: to rescue a child from a potentially dangerous situation. But the child's father, the alleged abuser, wasn't what they had imagined. Instead of a man full of anger and defiance, they were facing someone who appeared completely defeated, as though life itself had stripped him of any will to fight. His questions weren't about his own fate, his own arrest, but about the child he seemed to care for despite the accusations. The lead officer stepped forward, his voice firm and authoritative. "Roger Carter, you're under arrest," he declared, the words heavy in the silence of the room. It was a clear command, but the absence of resistance from Roger was palpable. Before Roger could respond, the cold clink of handcuffs echoed through the room as they were fastened around his frail wrists. His body seemed to sag with the weight of the metal, his shoulders slumping as though he had no strength left to oppose the officers. Yet, despite his obvious weakness, there was something in his eyes that remained focused, a single, desperate thought. Where was his son? He didn't struggle, didn't shout or beg for his freedom. Instead, Roger looked up at the officers, his eyes wide, vacant, as if trying to process what was happening around him. "Where's Henry?" he asked once more, his voice barely audible, but now tinged with a hint of fear, a slight quiver of urgency creeping into his words. But there was no answer. His question hung in the air, unanswered, as the officers continued with their duty. One of them pushed him out of the room, but even as he was led away, Roger's gaze never left the spot where his son should have been. His eyes were wide with concern, his face pale, and his voice quivered with desperation. "Where is Henry? Please, is he okay?" The officer didn't respond. The others kept moving, pushing Roger out of the room, but his words echoed in their minds. There was something wrong here, something that didn't quite add up. The officers were trained to expect violence in situations like these, but Roger's behavior defied that expectation. A man who was guilty of such cruelty should have been angry, defensive, shouting accusations, or defending himself. But Roger wasn't angry. He wasn't concerned for his own fate. He was only concerned for his son. That realization planted a seed of doubt in the minds of the officers. Could they be making a mistake? Was Roger truly the abuser they had been led to believe? Or was there more to this story than they had been told? The eerie silence lingered as Roger was escorted from the room, his voice barely more than a whisper now, still pleading for news of Henry. As the sound of their footsteps echoed through the old, freaky house, a strange unease began to creep into the officers' minds. They had come here thinking they were rescuing a child from the grip of domestic violence. But now, as they led Roger away, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that they were missing a piece of the puzzle. The questions they had thought they'd answered were now met with even more uncertainty. Had they just made a grave mistake? The police car raced through the dimly lit streets, its flashing lights reflecting off the windows as nightfall enveloped the town. Inside the vehicle, Roger sat still, his hands cuffed tightly, resting on his thighs. His face was pale, drawn with confusion and fear, as if he couldn't make sense of the world around him. He made no attempt to struggle or resist. Instead, his eyes kept darting about the interior of the car, searching desperately, as if hoping for someone, anyone, to explain what was happening to him. His breath was shallow, each inhale and exhale heavy with the weight of mounting worry. To him, the world had become a twisted nightmare, and he was trapped at the center of it, powerless to escape. When the car screeched to a halt in front of the police station, the sudden stop jolted Roger back into reality. He was pulled from the vehicle, his legs unsteady beneath him, as though his body could no longer find the strength to stand. The guards standing at the station watched him closely, their eyes narrowed, some exchanging silent, knowing glances. To them, this was just another case of capturing a dangerous abuser, someone who had threatened the safety of a child. They had come to believe they were heroes in this moment, saving an innocent from the clutches of a villain. But what they failed to realize was that Roger's broken posture and trembling form spoke volumes about a man who had been a victim himself, locked in his own hell for far too long. Inside the interrogation room, Henry sat curled up on a chair that seemed far too large for his small frame. His tiny hands were clenched into the fabric of his shirt, the material bunched up in his fists as he stared blankly at the floor. His swollen eyes betrayed the pain he had endured. He no longer cried loudly, no longer screamed out in fear or confusion. Instead, his shoulders trembled with quiet sobs, the weight of his emotions too much for his small body to contain. Mary stood close by, offering what comfort she could, gently patting his back. But it seemed as though Henry could no longer feel anything at all. He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally drained by the trauma he had endured. And yet, within the depths of his tired eyes, there was still something, an unspoken longing, a desire for something more than just safety. His eyes spoke of pain deeper than fear, a yearning for something he couldn't name. The door to the interrogation room creaked open, and Roger was pushed inside. As soon as he stepped into the room, his eyes immediately found Henry, sitting there in the far corner, staring at the floor. In that moment, it felt as though time itself stopped. Roger's voice was barely a whisper, filled with emotion and pain. "Henry," he breathed, the word carrying with it a weight of love, regret, and sorrow. But Henry didn't respond. He didn't speak, didn't run into his father's arms as Roger had hoped. Instead, he just looked at him, his eyes blank, devoid of the recognition Roger had longed for. There was no anger, no judgment in the child's gaze, just silence. The room seemed to grow heavier, and those standing outside could feel the weight of the moment. To them, this was supposed to be the moment the child was freed from the man he feared. This was supposed to be the resolution to the story, the villain arrested and justice served. But something wasn't right. Roger didn't look like a criminal who had been arrested. He didn't act like the abuser they had believed him to be. He looked more like a father facing the greatest nightmare of his life, a father whose very existence had been shattered by forces beyond his control. He was a man who had been defeated, both by the circumstances of his life and by the weight of the choices he had made. In that moment, it became clear to some officers that Roger was not the man they had thought him to be. They had expected to confront a monster, but all they saw was a man broken by the world. So why would Henry want his father arrested? Why would the child, who was now safe from harm, still seem distant, his emotions unreadable? The question lingered in the minds of some officers, who now questioned everything they had been told. Had they truly been saving an innocent child from abuse, or had they missed something far more complex? They still believed they were doing the right thing, that they had protected the child from a dangerous situation. But in the back of their minds, a seed of doubt began to sprout. Was the truth really as simple as it appeared, or was there more to this story than they had ever imagined? The interrogation room was suffocating in its tense silence as Roger entered, his hands still tightly cuffed behind his back. The cold light from the overhead lamp illuminated his gaunt, exhausted face. His eyes immediately locked onto Henry, but before he could speak, something no one had expected happened. Henry sprang up from the chair, his tiny legs charging forward without hesitation. "Dad!" the boy screamed, his voice choked with pent-up emotion. In an instant, Henry launched himself into Roger's arms, clutching his father's frail form as if terrified that if he let go, his father would vanish forever. No one in the police station moved. The room fell into stunned silence as looks of disbelief passed between the officers. A child who had just cried out, begging the police to arrest his father, was now running into his arms as if he were the only safe place in the world. This was completely contrary to everything they had imagined. There was no panic, no fear, only a pure love between a child and his father. Despite his hands being shackled, Roger still bent down, pressing his cheek into Henry's soft hair. His body trembled as silent tears streamed down his cheeks. "Henry, I'm here." His voice was rough, broken, as though each word was choked by the pain. His hands could not touch his son, but the love he had for him poured out in the tight embrace of the small shoulders around him. Outside the interrogation room, a few officers began to murmur. No one spoke, but the confused glances exchanged between them said it all. They had believed Henry needed to be protected from this man, but what they were witnessing was completely different from what they had imagined. Some of them felt as though they had made a terrible mistake, but no one dared to confirm it yet. In his father's arms, Henry continued to cry, not out of fear, but because for the first time, he was with the one person he wanted to protect. And in that moment, the people in the room began to understand that the truth might not be what they had thought. The interrogation room grew unbearably tense after that heart-wrenching embrace between father and son. The emotional weight of the moment was felt by everyone present, though it remained unspoken. Roger, still kneeling, struggled to control his emotions, his breath ragged as he fought against the overwhelming tide of feelings. Henry buried his face in his father's chest, tears staining the worn fabric of the man's shirt, the very shirt he had been wearing while handcuffed. The officers stood just outside the room, faces once firm with certainty, now shifting to confusion, even concern. They had believed they were protecting an innocent child from an abusive father, yet this moment raised an enormous question. Henry sobbed, his small shoulders trembling. He clung to his father as if fearing that if he let go, Roger would be taken away again. Amidst the sobs, Henry finally spoke a sentence that left everyone in the room in stunned silence. "I just want Dad to eat." A chilling silence enveloped the room. No one spoke. The officers, once confident in their mission, stood frozen, as if unable to process what they had just heard. Paul, who had been resolute in his decision to arrest Roger, felt a weight settle heavily in his chest. Mary, who had been watching with concern, instinctively placed her hand over her mouth, eyes wide in disbelief. Roger shuddered as he heard his son's words. His hands, still shackled behind his back, tightened into fists, not from anger, but from a deep, aching pain that seemed to emanate from the core of his being. He leaned forward, looking at Henry with a sorrow that was almost unbearable. "What did you say?" His voice trembled, as if he couldn't quite believe the words his son had just spoken. The interrogation room was suffocating in its silence. All surrounding sounds seemed to fade away, leaving only Roger's choked sobs as the sole sound in the room. He stood there, his bloodshot eyes clouded with tears, the gaunt face of a father made even more sorrowful as his tears flowed endlessly, mingling with the agony in his heart. He was too weak to rise, his hands cuffed behind his back as if they no longer belonged to him. His whole body seemed frozen, but his heart was twisted with the knowing that all his hopes had vanished. Henry, his little son, still could not fully comprehend the complexities of the world around him, but he understood that what his father needed was not money nor luxuries. What he needed was a meal to fill his father's stomach. How could a 6-year-old child worry about whether his father would survive another day? How could the child believe that the only way his father wouldn't go hungry was if he went to prison? When Henry spoke those words, the story transcended the boundaries of an ordinary case. No one in the room could stop staring at the child. The officers, who had once believed they were saving a child from an abuser, now had to confront a painful truth. They had been wrong. They hadn't saved Henry. They were only hurting the very child they had intended to protect. "I just want Dad to eat." Those words rang out like a desperate cry within the cold walls of the interrogation room. The words were not just from a child, but from the voice of injustice, of the pain imposed on the poor by society. What Henry desired wasn't salvation, it was life. The boy wanted one simple thing, for his father not to be hungry anymore. When Paul, the chief officer, witnessed this, it felt like a punch to the heart. They had rushed, hastily judged, and now all they could do was watch as the handcuffed father clung to his child in despair. The officers now understood that they weren't protecting Henry from an abuser. They were protecting him from an indifferent world that had forced this father to choose between death by starvation or death in prison. In that moment, the officers realized they were no different from the world that had trapped this father in a vicious cycle, one they had unknowingly perpetuated. Tears continued to fall from Roger's eyes as he looked at Henry, the child he loved more than anything in the world. One tear rolled down his cheek, not from the pain of being arrested, but from the overwhelming failure in his life, the failure to fulfill his role as a father, the pain of seeing his child live in fear, in a world filled only with hunger and hopelessness. Henry still clung to his father, despite the officers standing around, unsure of what to do or say. The 6-year-old child only wanted his father to stop being hungry, while the father endured the pain of not being able to do anything for his child except accept the punishment of an uncaring society. In that moment, not just Roger and Henry, but everyone in the room was pushed to the brink of awareness, and that truth was too painful to accept. The interrogation room fell into an eerie stillness. The officers' once sharp, confident eyes now dull and uncertain. They stood there, unsure of what to say, unsure of what to do. Some began to feel ashamed of themselves. They had been too quick, too eager to judge, letting their preconceived notions about a poor man cloud their judgment and lead them to make a grave mistake. One officer standing near the door wore a face full of regret, his eyes blurry as though questioning himself. They had thought of Roger as the perpetrator, the abuser, but now everything had changed. What they saw before them was a father struggling with life, in pain because he couldn't feed his child. And that pain transcended every societal judgment. This story was no longer just about one family. It was a condemnation of an unjust society, a society where poverty forced people into the most desperate of actions, a society where sometimes even individuals like Roger, with all their effort and love for their children, couldn't escape the gnawing pain of being poor. The officers no longer looked at Henry with suspicion, but with deep sympathy. They realized they had been negligent for too long in seeing the suffering of the powerless in society. They exchanged glances, eyes now filled with anger, but not directed at Roger. The anger was toward the very society they lived in, a society where the poor, the marginalized, are always left behind, where every mistake can cost dearly. These officers now saw clearly. They saw the price of ignoring the truth, even unintentionally perpetuating injustice. At this moment, they couldn't help but feel ashamed, realizing that their hasty judgment had torn a family apart. They were not only facing the failure of an investigation, but they also had to confront the harsh truth that in this society, there are things that are never seen until we truly stop and look at them for what they are. Roger wasn't an abuser. He was a victim of poverty, of the misguided decisions of a society that no one in this room, no officer of the law, had ever taken responsibility for. When everyone understood this, the anger was not directed at Roger, but at a society that offers no fairness to the poor and the vulnerable. Although everything had become clear and the truth had been painfully revealed, Roger could not be released. The story of a poor father wrongly assumed to be an abuser simply for trying to protect his child from hunger had now become a tragedy greater than ever before. The legal system, with all its bureaucracy and lack of flexibility, still demanded that procedures be followed. The delay in resolving this case left everyone in the police station feeling disappointed and powerless. They could not fathom why justice should take so long when everything was as clear as day. When Chief Officer Paul informed Roger that he would remain in custody for further investigation, despite everything that had transpired, a sense of outrage spread through the air. Roger sat there, still shackled, staring at Henry, the child he desperately wanted to care for and protect. The child no longer saw the strong father he once knew, but only a pitiful, exhausted man broken by the pain of a society that had abandoned him. The tears of both Roger and Henry were not only tears of despair, but also cries of indignation at a legal system that couldn't listen, couldn't react quickly to situations as clear as this. The audience could not help but feel outraged as they witnessed this. How could justice be so delayed? Why should a kind-hearted father like Roger continue to endure unnecessary suffering just because a legal system was too slow and too blind to recognize the truth? This question echoed in the minds of everyone watching, amplifying their frustration with a system that, in so many situations like this one, only caused more harm instead of delivering justice. The viewers felt helpless at the obvious injustice, and they began to question whether everything they had believed about the legal system was merely an illusion. Why was there no flexibility in the administration of justice when everything was so clear? Was it true that people are only treated fairly when they have enough power, money, or connections to speed up the legal process? These questions only fueled the flames of anger, making the audience anxiously await a major turning point, a powerful shock that could change everything. As the atmosphere in the police station remained thick and tense, an officer suddenly stood up, making the decision not to accept the injustice unfolding. It was Officer Mary, the young woman with gentle eyes, yet filled with determination. She had witnessed the helplessness and despair in Roger's eyes, the crying of Henry, and she couldn't stand by in silence any longer, continuing to watch as the slow-moving legal system crushed vulnerable people like them. Officer Mary, strong-willed and always acting according to her conscience, quickly walked over to Chief Officer Paul, her gaze unwavering and unafraid. She made a persuasive argument that they should not punish Roger, but instead needed to help him. Mary explained that this case wasn't just a misunderstanding or an oversight by the police, but rather a symptom of a society that had forgotten the poor. And now they had an opportunity to do something, to change that. She emphasized that if they didn't act immediately, a father who had suffered his entire life would continue to endure injustice, and a child would live in unnecessary fear and pain. As Officer Mary made her proposal, the entire interrogation room fell silent, and all eyes turned toward her. The other officers felt a deep sense of emotion, realizing they couldn't continue allowing the legal system to stifle the life of an innocent person simply because of rigid procedures. Some began to feel ashamed, not because Mary was wrong, but because they hadn't been able to stand up as she had. Mary urged them to do everything they could to help Roger, to convince the higher-ups to extend the time needed to clarify the situation rather than applying a punishment that was clearly undeserved. She proposed that instead of detaining Roger, they should find a way to enroll him in a program for struggling families, where he could receive not only legal support, but also emotional support. She believed that this was the only way to save people like Roger from a society that had always left them behind. This brief exchange, though short, struck deep in the hearts of the audience. How could a police officer stand up to defend the truth when the justice system had abandoned the poor, the vulnerable? That question urged the viewers to reflect and hope that justice would no longer be left to negligence. Now they were not only waiting for a turning point in the story, but also hoping for a bold action that could change everything. As Roger and Henry's struggles were brought into the light, a wave of sympathy and support from the community began to spread rapidly. The people in their neighborhood, the neighbors who had witnessed Roger's poverty and resilience, could no longer turn a blind eye to their heartbreaking situation. They began collecting food, clothes, and even money to help the father and son during this difficult time. Trucks filled with food, bags of warm clothing, and letters of encouragement from strangers arrived at Roger's home, a testament to the goodness of humanity. The police officers who had once doubted Roger now became companions in this journey. They didn't just stand by justice, but also showed empathy, collectively contributing to a fund for Roger's family. Officer Mary, who had stood up to protect the truth, not only brought hope to Roger, but also helped him reintegrate into society. The unity of the community helped a poor man not only overcome the pain of loss, but also dream of a brighter future. Most touching was when Roger was offered a job at the police station. Chief Officer Paul, full of regret for having hastily judged Roger, decided to give him a chance to rebuild his life. The job at the police station wasn't just a temporary position. It was a turning point in his life, enabling him to earn a living and take care of his child without the constant worry of poverty. When Roger accepted the job, he couldn't contain his emotions. His tears were no longer tears of despair, but tears of deep gratitude. Henry, the little boy, now saw a glimmer of hope in his father's eyes. Roger's smile slowly returned to his face. The father and son, though still facing many challenges ahead, at least no longer felt alone in their fight. Roger and Henry's story was no longer just about poverty. It had become a story about change, about a community coming together to help, about justice and compassion. And as the two walked out of the police station with a spark of hope in their eyes, the audience could not help but feel deeply moved, silently wondering, could we do more to help those in circumstances like theirs? Henry's life had been completely transformed ever since the support from the community and the police began pouring in for his family. Full meals, warm clothes, and simple toys that he had never dared to dream of had now become a part of his daily existence. For the first time in his life, Henry no longer had to worry about food, no longer had to hide in the dark corners of their home, hiding from the gnawing pangs of hunger. Instead, he could now play with friends, laugh with joy, and most importantly, Henry no longer felt that all-encompassing fear every time an adult appeared in his life. The feeling of being loved, cared for, and protected became the foundation of his world. Hot meals delivered by a caring neighbor, loaves of fresh bread, and sweet apples. These were things that Henry had never imagined he would receive. The simple, everyday kindnesses that others took for granted were now his. The feeling of being full, living in a home where food was never scarce, was a new reality that Henry had never known. He no longer had to hide his hunger, no longer had to endure the empty, aching feeling in his stomach. For the first time, he felt true peace. Peace in the certainty that tomorrow would bring not just survival, but comfort and care. Sitting at the dinner table with his father, Henry no longer had to fight off feelings of deprivation or fear. The love and understanding from those around them had healed wounds that Henry had carried silently for so long. Now Henry could feel the warmth of genuine love, not only from his father, but also from the entire community that had rallied around them. People who had been strangers just weeks ago were now offering their time, their resources, and their hearts to make sure that this little family, broken by years of hardship, would have a chance at happiness. Roger, the father who had once seemed so lost and defeated, could see the changes in his son's eyes. They spent moments together, talking about the future, about the dreams that once seemed unreachable, but now felt like something they could both dare to hope for. Henry now had a home filled with love, a place where he could feel secure, safe, and above all, loved. The father and son shared something they had never thought possible: hope. There were still struggles ahead. Life was never going to be easy. But Henry had found something he had never had before: faith in life. The warmth of the love and protection that now surrounded him gave him a new sense of strength. For the first time, he could wake up every day knowing he was loved, that he had people around him who cared for his well-being. This feeling was something that Henry had always longed for, but had never fully experienced. No longer was there darkness. No longer was there the constant fear of what would come next. Instead, there were sounds of laughter, the joyous echoes of a child playing freely, and the soft whispers of a father and son building dreams together. Henry no longer had to carry the weight of survival alone. The future that had once seemed so distant and uncertain now held the promise of hope and possibility. In the warmth of their home, as the days went on, Henry could feel something shifting inside him. It wasn't just the physical comfort of food and shelter, it was the feeling of belonging, the sense that he mattered. It was the first time in his young life that he felt like he had a right to be happy, a right to feel safe, and that just maybe, he had a future worth looking forward to. The bond between Roger and Henry grew stronger, not just through the material support they received, but through the emotional healing they had experienced. They had both been scarred by their struggles, but now there was something different in the air. There was the possibility of a better life ahead. Roger had found his son's smile again, and Henry had found his father's strength. Together, they were moving forward, one step at a time, into a future that no longer felt like a battle for survival but a chance to live with dignity, love, and hope. And for the first time in their lives, they were not facing the world alone. The community, the police, and even strangers who had stepped in to help had shown them that love, support, and empathy still existed in the world. The generosity of others had not only saved their lives, but had restored their belief in humanity. And in that, Henry had found the strength to face tomorrow with a smile, a heart full of gratitude, and a future that no longer felt out of reach. The story of Henry and Roger quickly spread throughout the town of St. John like a powerful wave that washed away any judgments or prejudices. The townspeople, who had once only cared about their own lives, suddenly stopped and reflected on things they had never noticed before. The story of this father and son, from a moment filled with confusion and suffering, had transformed into a powerful message of compassion and understanding. It moved the hearts of everyone who heard it, prompting them to ask themselves, "Have I done enough? What more can I do to help those struggling like Henry and Roger?" This story didn't just change how people viewed poverty, but it also revived their belief in the goodness within humanity. People began to realize that poverty isn't a crime. It's a consequence of circumstances and the injustices in society. Roger, a suffering father, had never been the abuser everyone had assumed him to be. He was simply a man trying to care for his child, even if his understanding of caring wasn't always the right one. And Henry, that innocent child, was only seeking the simplest way to stop living in the fear of hunger, wanting to see his father fed and cared for. The compassion of the community, the help from those around them, from the police officers to the neighbors, were small yet powerful acts. These people didn't just offer material help. They brought a new hope, a message that in the toughest times, we are not facing our struggles alone. With just a little kindness, a little care, everything could change. This story became a profound lesson for the whole town. It reminded everyone that compassion can change the world, even through the smallest of actions. A bowl of rice, a warm coat, a word of encouragement can make an immense difference in someone's life. And from then on, everyone in the community understood that rather than judging or turning away from those in poverty, we should reach out to help them, for anyone can fall into difficult circumstances, and with compassion, we can help each other overcome any challenge. This story of Roger and Henry is not just a lesson in forgiveness and compassion, but a powerful call to action for all of us. The pain and struggles they endured, though resolved, reflect a reality that many families face every day. We cannot stand by and watch, waiting for change to happen. If you believe that compassion can change the world, then it starts with you. Share this story. Bring it to your friends, family, and community. Don't let people like Roger and Henry face these challenges alone. Every small action, every bit of care, and every moment of help can make a world of difference. We can't change the past, but we can change the future. And it starts with your concern and your willingness to act. Let's spread the message of kindness and understanding. Let people see that we can do better, and together, we can create a world where no one has to face their struggles alone. All it takes is your belief and your action. And together, we can make the future brighter for everyone. If you believe in this message, don't forget to hit the subscribe button to stay connected and be part of this journey. Let's spread hope, compassion, and positive change, one story at a time.